The unsolved murder in a small town. When the victim's ghost began communicating, the small town of Harrows Creek had always been quiet, too quiet for something as sinister as murder. For years, the brutal death of Rachel Holloway, a young woman found lifeless in her own home with no clear suspect, haunted the streets. No one spoke of it much anymore. The case cold, and life moved on, as it always does in places where time feels like it's standing still. But something strange was happening. It started with whispers, low murmurs among the townsfolk, barely audible, but impossible to ignore. People had begun to hear Rachel's voice calling out to them in the dead of night just beyond the edge of their dreams. It wasn't until 2 months later, when Rachel's childhood friend Lily moved back to Harrows Creek, that the strange occurrences took on a more personal form. Lily had left the town as a teenager, escaping the shadow of the tragedy that seemed to define the place. But after years of living in the city, she'd come back to care for her ailing grandmother. And when she moved into her old house, she began to experience the inexplicable. It began with the lights flickering. At first, Lily thought it was just a faulty circuit, but the lights never stopped flickering. They flickered in patterns. 3 flickers in a row, then a pause, then 2 more. And then one night she heard it. A whisper. "Help me." Lily froze, the chill of terror creeping over her skin. It was unmistakable. Rachel's voice, so faint and delicate, yet filled with a desperation Lily hadn't heard in years. Her heart hammered as the room around her grew colder, her breath visible in the frigid air. She rushed downstairs, but there was no one there. The house was silent again. The lights flickered once more, then died completely. The next morning, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She walked through town, trying to convince herself that the voice she'd heard was just a figment of her imagination. But the locals, those who still remembered Rachel, looked at her strangely, as if they knew something she didn't. Then one evening, a strange message appeared in her inbox. No subject, just one line. "Look at the bloodstains in the attic." The sender's name? Rachel Holloway. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Who would send such a thing? Who else would know what happened in her own home that night? What Rachel had endured? The message felt like a warning. So Lily did the one thing she never thought she would. She returned to the attic. Her hands trembled as she opened the door, the stale, musty air flooding her senses. The wooden beams creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside. And then she saw it. Hidden in the corner of the attic, beneath the old, forgotten boxes of memorabilia, was a patch of the floorboards that was slightly darker than the rest. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed the faint outline of blood stains, smudged, faded, but still there. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. This was no accident. Rachel had tried to tell them something before she died, but no one had listened. Her hands shaking, Lily knelt in Vesco as she pried the floorboard loose. She found something buried beneath it. A small, blood-stained letter, sealed with a wax emblem. It was Rachel's handwriting. The letter was short, but haunting. "I know who did this to me. The one who promised to protect me is the one who killed me. I'll never be at rest until the truth is revealed. You must find me, Lily. You are the only one who can uncover the secrets they buried with me." Lily's mind raced. She knew Rachel had been close to someone. A man who had always promised to keep her safe. A man who had been the last to see her alive. But what if he wasn't the hero everyone thought he was? As Lily stood there, the cold draft of the attic seemed to swirl around her. And then she heard it again. The whisper louder this time. "Find me. Find the truth." She froze. Rachel's ghost was no longer just a whisper in the dark. She was a presence, one that would not rest until the mystery was solved. But who could she trust? Who in Harrows Creek had buried their secrets so deeply that they would go to any lengths to keep them hidden? Lily knew then that she had no choice but to follow Rachel's voice wherever it would lead her, even if it meant uncovering a truth more horrifying than she could ever imagine. Because in a town like Harrows Creek, sometimes the ghosts of the past are the only ones who can uncover the monsters in the present. And Rachel was waiting. Lily had always thought that the nightmares she'd been having since returning to Harrows Creek were simply a result of the stress of her return. But after finding the letter, hearing Rachel's whisper, and seeing the bloodstains in the attic, she couldn't deny it any longer. The past had come back to claim her, and it would not let her rest until the truth was uncovered. And the first revelation, the missing journal. It was early morning when Lily decided to take her first step into the past. Again. She returned to her grandmother's house where Rachel's haunting voice had first reached her. Lily had barely slept, but the need to uncover the truth was greater than the weariness that clung to her bones. The attic was now a place of dread, but it also held the key to understanding Rachel's fate. As she rummaged through boxes and crates, Lily found an old, dust-covered journal that wasn't there before. It wasn't Rachel's, but it was written by someone else. The leather cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it. The first entry read, "She's gone, and I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself." Lily's pulse quickened. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Rachel's boyfriend, Grant Henderson's. The journal was a confession of guilt, of turmoil and grief, but it quickly turned into something darker. Rachel had been the target of someone close to her, someone who had promised to keep her safe. Lily was about to read more when the journal ripped itself out of her hands, falling to the floor with a loud thud. A bitter gust of wind swept through the attic, slamming the windows shut with violent force. And then there was a voice. Rachel's voice. "He killed me. But you won't stop him, will you?" Lily spun around, her heart in her throat. The attic lights flickered. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room. Panic surged through her body. Suddenly, the door to the attic slammed shut. Her mind raced. Had Rachel's spirit been angry? Had she been too close to the truth? And just then, the lights went out completely. The night at the lake, the pursuit of answers. Lily was shaken, but she couldn't stop now. Rachel was desperate, and Lily was the only one who could piece together what had happened. Grant was the next logical step. He'd been the last person to see Rachel alive, but when Lily visited his home, the place felt off. The house was in disrepair, as though it Hadn't been lived in for years. But Grant's car was parked out front. Something felt wrong about the whole situation, and Lily's instincts told her that Grant was hiding something. As night fell, Lily's fear was compounded by the terrifying thought that Grant had fled, maybe even for good. She decided to follow the only lead she had left, the lake. Rachel had loved the lake, and she spent countless hours there. It had been her secret hiding place. When Lily arrived, the moon cast an eerie glow over the still water. She approached the shoreline, walking cautiously toward the small dock that led into the lake. But as she got closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. At the edge of the dock, the water rippled unnaturally, as if something, or someone, was moving just beneath the surface. Lily leaned in closer. Suddenly, the reflection of her face on the water changed. The face of Rachel Holloway stared back at her, but it wasn't a mirror image. It was twisted, pale with lifeless eyes. Rachel's face was distorted, almost like a warning. "Don't go any further," the voice whispered, soft and guttural. Lily froze. She could feel something cold pressing against her chest, suffocating her. The water began to churn, pulling at her legs, dragging her toward the edge. Before she could react, a cold, invisible force gripped her, and she was yanked off her feet, plunging into the icy water. Gasping for air, Lily fought the undertow. But the more she struggled, the stronger the pull became. She barely managed to break the surface, but a shadow in the water loomed beneath her. It wasn't just the reflection. Something was down there. Something alive, something malicious. A hand shot out from the dark waters, grabbing her ankle, pulling her back under. In a panic, she scratched and kicked at the cold hand, but it wouldn't let go. "Find the truth." Rachel's voice echoed in her mind. But Lily couldn't breathe, couldn't fight the weight pulling her down. The discovery of the grave, facing the past somehow. Lily survived. She was found washed up on the shore hours later, shivering and bruised but alive. When she awoke, the first thing she saw was the town sheriff standing over her. "You shouldn't be here, Lily. It's too dangerous," he said, his eyes filled with concern and fear. But Lily wasn't listening anymore. She knew what had to be done. There was one last piece to the puzzle, Rachel's final resting place. Lily had heard rumors, whispers, in town, about a forgotten grave on the outskirts of the cemetery. The sheriff had always denied it, but now, after everything she had encountered, Lily knew better. Her heart pounded as she ventured to the graveyard that evening, the sun dipping below the horizon. The air felt thick with dread. There, hidden behind overgrown weeds and vines, was a gravestone, unmarked, covered in moss. Beneath it, she could feel an unnatural chill. With trembling hands, she dug into the earth. As the dirt fell away, the unmistakable shape of a small box emerged. Inside was a delicate gold locket. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she opened it, revealing a small photograph of Rachel and Grant, side by side, looking happy, together. But behind them, faint in the background, was another figure, a shadowy shape that looked disturbingly out of place, and then it hit her. The locket was never meant for Rachel. It was a clue. Rachel had known the truth about Grant and someone else, someone who had silenced her before she could tell anyone. The shadows in the photo weren't just an anomaly. They were the killer. At that moment, a chilling realization washed over Lily. The killer was still out there, and he knew she was getting too close. As she turned to leave, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, sending her tumbling into the darkness below. The last thing Lily saw before the world went black was the figure of a man standing in the graveyard, his face masked by shadows, watching her fall. The final confrontation, the face of the killer. Lily awoke to find herself in an old, abandoned house, the house Rachel had lived in. The walls were cracked and covered in decay, and the air smelled of death. The voice that had haunted her now filled her ears. "I warned you, Lily. You should have stopped. You should have let me rest." And then, the man stepped forward, his face half shrouded in shadow. It was Grant. But the Grant she knew was gone. The man before her was twisted, unrecognizable, his eyes wild and crazed. "You should have listened to Rachel. She was right about me." Before Lily could scream, the world went dark once more, and all she heard was Rachel's voice, now clear and desperate. "I never wanted this. But now, you'll finish what I started. Find the killer, Lily. Only you can stop him." Lily's search for the truth would take her to unimaginable places, both within herself and in the dark corners of Harrows Creek. The terror was far from over. Lily's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as the shadows in the old house closed in around her. Grant stood motionless, the eerie silence between them filled with the chilling weight of his words. His gaze was hollow, eyes darkened as though the man she once knew was no more. "You should have stayed away, Lily." Rachel knew. She always knew. The air grew thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on her. Lily struggled to move, but her feet felt glued to the floor. Her eyes darted around, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The walls were closing in, but not physically. The house was beginning to shift, twist. The foundation felt wrong, as though it were a living thing, changing shape with every heartbeat, the low, rhythmic thud of a heart. Was it hers? Was it the house itself? And then the whisper. "The truth doesn't need to be found, Lily. You are my bait. I want you to join me." Laughing in ghostly voice. The voice was soft, hauntingly familiar. Rachel's voice. But it was distorted, like an echo from another realm. A chill ran through Lily's spine as she turned toward the source of the sound and felt betrayed. Rachel's image appeared before her, not a mere reflection, but a vision. The ghostly figure of Rachel stood in the doorway, her face pale, expression mournful. The ethereal glow of her presence flickered like a dying flame, and in her eyes, anguish, anger. "Why did you come here, Lily? Why did you think you could solve this?" Rachel's voice trembled, full of pain. Lily's pulse raced. "Who is real, Rachel?" Lily cried and sighed. She opened her mouth to respond, to beg for answers, but her throat felt constricted, as though an unseen force was choking her. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees. Rachel's ghost began to fade. "Lily!" Rachel's voice cracked. It was no longer a whisper, but a desperate scream that pierced through the house. "Let him take you too!" It was as if two ghosts were there. Lily felt an overwhelming force pulling her in every direction. The air grew colder, freezing until her breath came out in visible puffs, her fingers turning blue as frost crept along her skin. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, as if the house itself were waking, groaning in protest. The floorboards splintered, the walls cracked like thunder, and then everything went dark. The vanishing. The sheriff arrived at the old house at dawn, summoned by frantic phone calls from Lily's concerned grandmother. There had been no sign of Lily for hours. When he entered the decrepit house, the atmosphere was thick with something unnatural. The place seemed empty, yet alive, with a presence that chilled him to the bone. He called out, his voice echoing in the hollow silence, but there was no response. Slowly, he made his way through the house, his hand on his gun, prepared for anything. As he reached the attic, a strange noise caught his attention. A faint tapping like the sound of someone knocking from within the walls. His heart hammered in his chest. As he stepped into the attic, the air grew colder still, and the smell of decay, familiar and putrid, filled his nostrils. The dust in the room had shifted. There on the floor was Rachel's old journal, opened. A page fluttered under an invisible draft. The words on the page, unclear, from where he stood. But the sheriff was too distracted by the sound, too terrified by the ghostly whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Lily ... The voice was unmistakable. He turned, his heart pounding. There, in the center of the room, was Lily. But she wasn't Lily anymore. Her eyes were wide, vacant. Her skin was pale, as if the life had been drained from her. Her hair hung limply like strands of dark silk, obscuring her face. She stood motionless, staring blankly at the far wall. "Lily!" the sheriff shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "Lily, where are you? What happened?" The woman who was once Lily didn't respond. She simply stood there, unmoving. And then, in a voice not her own, a cold whisper filled the room. "The truth doesn't set us free." A chill raced down the sheriff's spine as he stepped toward her, unsure of what to do. The floor beneath his feet creaked, as though the house were alive, as though it were watching him. And then, suddenly, Lily's head snapped to one side, her eyes now wide and wild, filled with a terror that no living person could possess. Her mouth opened with a scream, a piercing, blood-curdling sound that shook the very walls of the house. It echoed through the entire town. The sheriff stumbled back in horror, but he couldn't move fast enough. The air seemed to solidify, thick and heavy. He couldn't breathe. Before he could react, Lily reached out. Her hand touched his chest, and the world stopped. Everything went silent. The town seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff gasped for air, but there was none. He looked down, expecting to see his own hand on his chest. But instead, the pale, lifeless fingers of Lily were sinking into his flesh like a shadowy imprint on his very soul. Her grip tightened and her face contorted with a mixture of sadness and rage. "Help me find the truth." The sheriff's vision blurred, his body growing weaker with each passing second. He tried to scream, but no sound came. Lily's grip tightened, pulling him into a black void where there was no light, no sound, no escape. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it ended. The sheriff was gone. The house was silent once more. The mystery, unsolved. Weeks passed. The townspeople of Harrows Creek whispered about the sheriff's disappearance. They said the house had become a place where the past was trapped forever and that no one dared enter again. The police, unable to explain the strange disappearances of both the sheriff and Lily, left the case unsolved. They sealed the house off, but the town, once so quiet, began to change. People started seeing Rachel again, not just in their dreams, but in the streets, in the corners of their houses, in reflections. Her ghost was everywhere, but she never spoke. Her eyes were empty, pleading for something, for someone to finally uncover the truth. And in the years that followed, stories began to circulate. People said they heard whispers in the night, calling out for Lily, calling for anyone who would listen. The name Harrows Creek became synonymous with mystery, with death, with haunting. But the truth was buried. The house still stood, crumbling with age and haunted by the souls it had claimed. No one dared enter. No one ever figured out who had murdered Rachel Holloway, or why. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, Lily's soul was trapped, waiting, forever bound to a truth that could never be uncovered. For in Harrows Creek, some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. Follow Mr. Terrifying Nightmare Channel for more.